This is your home for St. Cloud State hockey, keeping you up to date on the NCHC.
One-timer, come in, they score! Ripped in! A bomb from Permix!
Women's WCHA.
So Dana Rasmussen fires and she scores! Dana Rasmussen for the Huskies alongside
The National Hockey League.
Dwayne Kaprizov in for a chance to win it! He scores! Kirill, the thrill is for real! Welcome to the NHL, a game winner!
And everything from the state of hockey.
St. Cloud Cathedral is now 42.6 seconds away from wrapping up the school's first ever title.
Welcome to the Huskies Warming House Podcast Den.
And welcome back to the Den, Husky Warming House podcast fans. It is episode number 60. I am your host, Nick Max, and my co-host is Noah Grant. In this week's episode, we take a look at the playoff picture that is starting to take shape in the National Hockey League. We'll also get, finally, some confirmation out of the seniors that are returning back to the St. Cloud State men's hockey team. A couple of other topics. Does fighting have a place in the game of hockey today? And then our extra ice session. We also talk about the NHL's Department of Player Safety. We are recording here on Saturday because tomorrow was Mother's Day. Noah, being that it is Saturday, we normally are doing this Sunday morning. First of all, welcome to the show, and how you been, dude?
It's been good. I've been hanging out and I don't know, excited for Mother's Day, which of course will be today/tomorrow, if you will, when this of course airs. But I've been good. Finally secured some changes into my job, a couple of different changes. I thought I was gonna be working at a hotel more often. Turns out I got offered the assistant director of marketing position for a corporation here down in Minot. They offered me a gig based on my work for the ACHA tournament a couple of weeks ago. So that's kind of cool. Excited with the crew that's there, and cannot wait for summer. How about you?
Just finished up my last final this Thursday. So now it's summer kicking into high gear here in about a week. I will be taking at least one summer class. In a year from now, Noah, as strange as this is, as old as I am, I'll finally be graduating with a bachelor's degree from St. Cloud State. So that
we'll see.
We'll see, right? There's still time to not make that happen. But with that being said, Noah, our first segment is the Huskies Illustrated Weekly Round.
Center Ice View News and Notes. Center Ice View provides you with the best coverage of St. Cloud State Huskies hockey, from game notes, recaps, photos, and more. Go to centericeview.com.
Starting with our first topic here, Noah, the National Hockey League, as you mentioned before, a couple more teams punching their ticket to the postseason. Also, some scenarios could play out tonight that might lock in the final two playoff spots in the National Hockey League. Vegas, Colorado, Minnesota, and St. Louis, all representing the Honda West Division, has all punched their tickets, while Pittsburgh, the Washington, Boston, and the Islanders are the top four in the Mass Mutual East. In the Discover Central, it's Carolina, Tampa Bay, Florida, and while the Nova Scotia North has Toronto, Edmonton, and Winnipeg locked in, so a couple of spots still open. But let's go back to the Central. Nashville only needs to win one of its final two contests to clinch a playoff spot in a fight with Dallas, I should say. The Stars do have an opportunity, however, to make the postseason. They would need to win their final two, but also they would also need Nashville to lose their final two games as well to get a playoff berth. Now, the only other team that has a likely playoff berth, Noah, is Montreal, who can clinch as early as tonight with a single point against the Maple Leafs and a Vancouver Canucks loss in regulation. Now, if the Canucks cannot make the playoffs, of course, they will be looking to an off season that will probably be doing some many changes. One will be their minor league and a relocation. The AHL affiliate of the team will move closer to Vancouver. Right now, looks like it's heading to Abbotsford, British Columbia. The team is currently spent the past couple of years in Utica, New York. Vancouver's new affiliate name, logo, and brand is still not yet known once the move does take place. But sticking in the AHL, a franchise owned by the New Jersey Devils will also move from Binghamton, New York to Utica, bringing next season as well. So the Utica Comets it announced a 10-year deal affiliation with the Devils with that move. And the organization will keep the same name, same logo, but will reveal New Jersey designs and colors later on before the start of next season.
Sticking around the state of New York, Nick, in the Big Apple, the New York Rangers, they've had an interesting week, to say the least. Team owner James Dolan fired general manager Jeff Gorton and president John Davidson last Wednesday, promoting former NHLer and assistant general manager Chris Drury to both of those roles. The Rangers were embroiled in a $250,000 fine from the National Hockey League after they released a statement calling for former NHLer and current Department of Player Safety lead George Parros to be removed as the head of the department. Parros has come under fire after Washington forward Tom Wilson injured Rangers star Artemi Panarin in a prior contest last Monday. The Rangers believe that Wilson, who is a repeat offender, should have been suspended for his actions on the ice, and instead he only received a $5,000 fine. The firings were not related to that incident, and the owner stated that the group has needed a culture change after the first 20 games of the season. In Drury's first game in his new role, the Rangers retaliated on Wilson and the Capitals on Wednesday with a line brawl in the opening moments of that game, plus a fight that injured Wilson in the contest. It was Washington, however, that would have the last laugh as former World Warrior TJ Oshie netted a hat trick in the win. Oshie has recently been dealing with the passing of his father, Tim, who passed away at the age of 56. A recognizable father figure and coach, Tim had been battling Alzheimer's since 2012, but was able to watch TJ win a Stanley Cup back in 2018 with Washington. The hat trick performance was TJ's first game back since his father's passing.
All our thoughts and prayers go out to TJ and Coach Oshie for his passing. So some sad news again from a Minnesota native, but some other milestones in the NHL were held this week. First, Vegas netminder Marc-Andre Fleury did pass Roberto Luongo for third on the all-time wins list, collecting his 490th career victory against Minnesota earlier this week. Fleury, who is 36 years of age, does sit 61 wins behind Hall of Famer puck stopper Patrick Waugh for second on that list at 551. Marty Brodeur, however, leads their group with 691 career victories as an NHL starting goaltender. Sticking out West Kings forward Anze Kopitar nabbed his 1,000th career point with an assist against the game in Arizona. Kopitar is the fourth King in franchise history to hit the milestone and the first Slovenian to do it as well. Another NHL news, Toronto has signed forward Kirill Semenov to a one-year deal starting next season. The 26-year-old had 26 points in 60 games this year in the Continental Hockey League, where he has been since 2013. He also added 9 playoff points en route to winning their Gagarin Cup, the KHL's version of the Stanley Cup, Noah.
In our second to last topic, Nick, the Buffalo Sabres have had a rare bright spot this past week. Goaltender Michael Hauser added his second win in as many games this past week for the club against the New York Islanders. While the goaltender wins are pretty common in the NHL, even in Buffalo at times this season, Hauser's first 2 victories of his NHL career are unique. Facing 48 shots in his first contest and 36 in his second, Hauser, he's currently 28 years old. Before his NHL debut, following a year away from in-game competition, he hasn't played above the ECHL level since making a 9-minute AHL appearance in 2017-18. For those who don't know, it's the NHL, the AHL, and then the ECHL in terms of league order. The Ohio-born netminder spent the majority of the last 4 seasons in the ECHL, and 8 years he's toiled in the minor leagues before being called up due to injuries to 5 Buffalo Sabres goaltenders. He currently finished his 4th contest today against Pittsburgh, with play-by-play voice Rick Jeanneret on the call for the Buffalo season finale. Jeanneret, who turned 79 in July, is celebrating his 50th year on the air with the club. He called the year unfortunately disappointing for the Sabres, who currently finished in last place, having not made the playoffs in 10 seasons.
Rick Jeanneret, yes, the improbable Hall of Fame voice of the Buffalo Sabres. I think my favorite call, Noah, of his is Mayday. Mayday. I don't think anybody who has been around the game of high has not heard that call. But to wrap things up here, Noah, in this week's roundup, the 5 injuries, although have come in the National Hockey League. Now, Artemi Panarin had his season end against that same scrum that we will talk a little bit more about later with Tom Wilson. Again, he was in that game against the Rangers. Ottawa defenseman Thomas Chabot is also done for the year. But a little bit closer to home, former St. Cloud State forward Ryan Poehling underwent surgery for looks like a wrist injury. He was actually leading the Laval Rockets with 25 points in 28 games this year in the AHL before he came down with that injury. However, going up to the big club in Montreal was still without goaltender Carey Price and is also now missing forward Philip Deneau, who is now sidelined with a concussion. Lastly, the Washington Capitals will be without star forward Alex Ovechkin, who is again out with a nagging lower body injury. And after essentially only playing one shift in his return against the Rangers just a few nights ago. Back into the Husky Warming House podcast, getting in episode number 60. Myself, Nick Maxim, my co-host Noah Grant. Noah, a couple of housekeeping procedures. Trivia took place earlier this afternoon, which you fill in the listeners about what the question was, the answer, maybe who won week 2 of season 2 here of the trivia session here for the Huskies Warming House podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, Caleb Peabody, who we had on the show this past week, was the first winner of season 2 of trivia last week. So joining him on the leaderboard this week was Fight the Pants. Of course, trivia every Saturday at noon. I should clarify, because I think some people maybe are still confused about this. The first correct answer to answer that trivia question is our winner. So even if you get the answer correct, you got to be the first one to answer it correct in order to have the win. We've had a couple people that had some close calls here, almost getting their first win on the leaderboard. But Fight the Pants, a previous winner, but his first win of season number 2, like you mentioned. The question did read, this past season, St. Cloud State men's hockey senior forward Kevin Fitzgerald had 18 points on the year, including being the visiting team during the games in the NCHC pod. How many of those points were scored on the road? Nick, did you happen to see this question? Do you know what the answer to this is?
I didn't see the question, but I know he had a ton of road success this year. I'm going to guess 19 points.
Well, he only had 18 on the year, so tell me how that one works.
I thought you said 28.
That's his number.
So let me go back to that. Let's go 12. How about that?
You're very, very close. 13 is the answer. Fight the Pants was our winner. 13 of Kevin's 18 total points did come on the road this year. His first 9 points of the year came out when playing as the visiting team. His first home point did not come until, get this, February 5th. Against Western Michigan. So kind of an interesting little transition there. Nick, as we look forward to a men's hockey player that is now officially, as far as we know, returning, and another men's hockey player who's been so great to this organization that is moving on to a different stepping stone in his collegiate path.
That's right. So let's first talk about the players that have confirmed their return, and then we'll talk about the one that will unfortunately not be returning. So again, you and I talked about this a couple of weeks prior. Again, Brett Larson had also kind of gave us some hints, was that Kevin Fitzgerald, Seamus Donahue, Easton Brodzinski, Luke Jaycox, and I'm missing one person, and I can't believe I'm missing this. Who am I missing? Is it really that obvious, Noah?
Well, I mean, while you think about it here, for some reason, I don't know why we can't think of it either. I would say there's one more senior that has made his addition to that lineup that maybe you want to talk about.
Yes, exactly. That is David Rennick was the last piece of the puzzle, at least from what we were hearing. It was also a couple of weeks ago when we had Brett Larson on that gave us an indication that he was confident that the goaltender would have an opportunity to return to St. Cloud. I know that, at least for me personally, Noah, I know that as an NHL draft pick, we know of David Rennick. He looked really, really, really good down the stretch for this Husky squad. And so you kind of, we had the sense that we wouldn't have been surprised to see David possibly sign his pro deal with LA, whether it was a pro deal or a minor league deal. And I think all of us would have been happy for him. But it sounds like now confirming now with St. Cloud State Athletics that David Rennick is indeed back in between the pipes, at least for one more season here for the Cardinal Black, which is, I think, is good news for a team that it sounds like is very, very hungry to get back to the national championship game and have a little bit of redemption tour, if you want to call it, for as you could say, how they performed in that championship game.
Yeah, a lot of moving parts here, of course, with any potential signing. I think it's good news for a lot of people and a lot of groups, and I think you might touch on this later. I think it's good news for everybody except maybe potentially the two goaltenders behind him, but nonetheless, we'll get into that in just a second. If you're looking for this Los Angeles Kings organization, you've got Jonathan Quick, who's moving towards the tail end of his contract. You've got Cal Peterson, Notre Dame product, who has looked really, really good, I think, in his first couple of years as a pro, and potentially maybe could be the guy as soon as Jonathan Quick's time is done. And then that's where the Kings look and say, is David Rennick the next guy up in that organization? Is he the guy they feel can maybe take that next step? My answer, and if we're being honest, and I think if David was sitting here, I'd say the same thing. I don't think David's ready for that jump yet. I think if he made the jump, I think he'd be okay. I think that the Los Angeles Kings, David Rennick, Brett Larson, Huskies fans, we all want to see the same thing. And that's David Rennick's form in the months of February, March, and April be that consistent baseline for him through an entire NCHC season. I think that's the next stepping stone. And I think David Rennick, recognizes the opportunity that this group has to get back to a Frozen Four again, but two, understands that imagine what this group can do, not only in regional play, but in the NCHC and in the NCAA, if he plays like he did in the final 2.5 months of the season for the Huskies. So I think it's a good move for everybody involved, where he can continue to kind of raise his stock with the Los Angeles Kings group, who is kind of biding their time with Jonathan Quick in their rebuild process. And maybe he opens the door a little bit wider for himself when he tries to make that next jump based on his play next season.
I actually agree with you on that sentiment. And, we talk about developmental timelines, right? And I think as we look at the NHL, goaltenders are I should say stereotypically the lightest to develop and turning to get to their pro form. So I agree. I think, it certainly can't hurt you if you're David Rennick to take an extra year. Of course, when you're playing, essentially, from what we know, this is still his net to give away, as long as he's playing consistently. And like you said, I think just his play to be more consistent at the level he saw the final 60 days of the season. I think, again, that's going to be probably his challenge, is how do you pick up right where you left off after this past season? And that's going to be, I think, the challenge for a lot of these players coming back is, how do we keep that baseline here? But then again, also, how do we bring it up to the next level? So it's an exciting opportunity here for Huskies fans. And I think also for fans, as we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, Wally, with the fans, but also Brett, is getting the opportunity to, hopefully, as things move forward in the pandemic, we get a chance to get the fans back inside the Herb Brooks National Hockey Center, be able to see these guys in person and to cheer them on, inside the Herb. So I think it's all good. But in a different transition, you can feel good for these situations here, Noah, too, and that is Trevor Zins, who had been with the organization for a couple of years, didn't really see any consistent eye time. He did confirm he was transferring, and he is transferring to St. Thomas, which I think is going to be good for him. I think he's going to compete immediately for ice time there. They've already got a really good, solid goaltender and former North Dakota product, Adam Scheel. So, no, I kind of want to get your initial reaction to the transaction and to what it means for Trevor Zins and also for the Huskies as they look at their roster depth for next season.
Yeah, well, in an odd way, and this is no offense to Trevor, it makes things a little bit easier for the coaching staff. It makes it easier for the guys who are in that locker room, knowing that that's one less player that they have to have on their radar. I think one of the things that I like about Trevor, and from what we've heard of all the guys, is, like you mentioned, he didn't have a whole lot of consistent playing time, but at the same time, he was a great locker room presence, a great teammate off the ice. And I think that bodes well when you have a player that, one, is a good character, off the ice, in the locker room, in the classroom, whatever it may be. But then two, you've got a player that, again, has been with a great organization like St. Cloud and is chomping at the bit to get some ice time. He's going to get a real good kick at the can with this St. Thomas group. And like we mentioned, it's not, and this is no offense to these programs that a program that I might mention here, but like RPI, for example, he's not coming from a team that maybe didn't play last year or maybe, wasn't the strongest team in the NCAA. He was with a St. Cloud State team that was a runner-up in the national championship game. So you want to talk about that transition and that development process that he's gone through with Brett Larson, Dave Shayak, Nick Oliver. That's going to prepare him to be under a coach like Rico Blase. And I imagine his game will improve leaps and bounds. Will he be in the lineup? I guess we don't know compared to the makeup of what it's going to be, but we wish him the best. And the other thing that I think I'd mentioned too, Trevor's been great with us as far as, like, he follows our podcast. He, likes our things and that sort of thing. And I think that just says something about the person that he is understanding that his role when he wasn't on the ice is to be that glue guy in the locker room, and really excited for him. And honestly, I hope he takes it and runs with it and becomes a key impact player.
And yeah, I think that's the biggest thing is, even though the opportunity maybe necessarily wasn't here with St. Cloud, we do want him to have a good, fresh, clean opportunity. My enunciation today, Noah, is just horrendous. So I do apologize for those who are listening.
You wanted to mention enunciation and making a point, though. Maybe we want to go back to this piece, though, about David Rennick, though. You had mentioned one thing about how David Rennick coming back maybe affects two great goaltenders that unfortunately are vying for that ice time, similar to what Trevor was doing for the past couple of years.
Yeah, and I think it's a double-edged sword, right, Noah? Because we had all three goaltenders on last August, I believe, or last September here on the show, and you can tell these all three guys support each other. They're there to be, each other's, lift up presence. That they all want each other to succeed. But at the end of it, you're still competing for one spot, and that's to be the one that's in between the pipes on game day, right? So, one of the, I don't know if you want to call it a downside, but one of the, if you're the coaching staff, one of the good problems to have is the depth that St. Cloud State has between the pipes. Now, if I'm Joey Lamoureux and I'm Jackson Castor, and of course I'm not speaking for them, but it is sort of a mixed message. If I'm sitting there going, yeah, it's going to be great to have David back as a teammate and certainly as a player. But if I'm Castor, if I'm Lamoureux, that also means that now, my opportunity maybe to secure a starting goaltending spot, or maybe to get more looks at the can, just kind of in the same situation Trevor Zins was. Well, now you have to start to think, well, where is that there? Now, again, with college hockey, it's still no different than pro, right? If David doesn't perform well, if there's an injury, we certainly, obviously hope that's not the case, but, you never know what an opportunity could come knocking. But I still got to think too, for Jackson and for Lamoureux that, I don't think it would have surprised me if either one of them would have entered a transfer portal in that sense, because I think they're both quality goaltenders. And I think there is always that competitive itch, even though, St. Cloud is such a tight-knit group, the culture there is so great. But you still, at the end, you want to play hockey, right? So Noah, I'm kind of curious as to what your thoughts are in this sort of situation. If you're Joey Lamoureux, if you're Jackson Castor, yes, great to have David back. He's going to be really good between the pipes. So for your own personal growth and success, now there's a question mark that maybe wasn't quite there just maybe a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I think the challenge is when you're thinking about things like the transfer portal. I don't think either of those guys are, but I mean, not to say that it hasn't crossed their mind. I would probably say if there was one program I could have seen either of them going to, it might have been actually Bemidji State. Similar because they lost their starting goaltender, right, moving on to the University of North Dakota. You've got Adam Scheel, who moves on to St. Thomas as well. And you maybe have that void where you could step in and maybe try to vie and be that guy out there as well. Again, the other thing to remember too is that essentially this year for these goaltenders potentially is a reset, right? They still could have their normal eligibility again, just because of the fact that everybody gets that extra year. They might, after David Rennick is done this year, they might continue to try to vie for those spots and continue to grow in that area as well. So one, it's a great problem to have. Like you mentioned, it breeds competition, it breeds those opportunities. But with that being said, you've got three quality goaltenders, and it's not a top pairing for defensemen. It's not a third line forward group. There's only one goaltender that plays on each given night, most nights. So, you feel for them a little bit. You feel for them because they're great goaltenders. David Rennick is a fantastic goaltender too, but you feel for him because that they have a lot to offer. And I think that it's difficult in respect too, because people talk about, who's the next guy up? Is it Jackson Castor? Is it Joey Lamoureux? Both those guys are equally good goaltenders, and both those guys really have a lot to prove, and they just unfortunately haven't gotten that ice time. They're probably the only two people that have mixed emotions about David coming back. I'm sure they love David. It sounds like everybody loves David. I don't know how you can, but again, they're hockey players. They want to play hockey. So I don't know. I guess we'll have to see how it plays out, but you hope that if anything, they're going to be good teammates. They're going to be supportive. And if anything, they're going to push David in practice to be the goaltender he was in April and then some.
I agree. Speaking of fighting, in a really, nice little transition here, Noah. I know, right? We're not talking about fighting for a spot in the lineup, but we're also talking about fighting in its role, especially at the NHL level. Now, hockey, if you're a casual fan, especially if we rewind the clocks back 40 years, I know you were just not even a twinkle in your mother's eye, but we'll get to that later. But it was a large entertainment draw for the casual fan of the National Hockey League. I think as a fan, not just a casual, but a very in-depth fan, I think the game has obviously evolved to much more of a speed and skill game. And I think the game is very enjoyable to watch. And with this transition, especially over the past 15 years or so, since the last season-ending lockout from 04 to 05, what we've seen is, essentially, I call it the enforcers, the goons, the guys who maybe could skate a shift or two a night, but go out there and try to protect it. That has essentially gone on the wayside, but it hasn't really taken the edge, the sort of that fight back spirit that has been in the game for a very long time. And with the incident that we'll get into a little bit more in depth here with Tom Wilson, Artemi Panarin, and Pavel Buchnevich, the question now still remains is, does fighting still have a place in the game of hockey? And before I gave my thoughts, I'm kind of curious as to what your thoughts are on this topic.
Well, this is actually a segment that's inspired by Go Huskies Woo, and actually our group chat with him and Caleb Peabody talking about that game and that sort of thing. So shout out to you, Go Huskies Woo. We love you. But I know him and I kind of maybe disagreed on this topic. I 110% fighting still has a place in the game of hockey. And I think if you asked a lot of players, they would say the same thing. One documentary I would encourage people to check out is the documentary Ice Guardians. I think makes a great couple of points about why fighting is the way that it is. And a couple of, I'd love to run into some counter arguments here. Would you like to do those counter arguments, or would you like to kind of lay out the scene here of the incident from the past week first? Either or.
Let's start with the counterpoints, I think, just because I think
Sure.
it kind of would transition well to what I have to say about it.
Sure. Well, I gotta make you look good, Nick. Come on now. But one of the first counterpoint, of course, is that basically all other major sports don't have fighting. That's one of the first things. And my argument to this is not that the game shouldn't change. Things shouldn't always be archaic. Fighting has always been a part of the game of hockey. It's just been a thing that's been a part of the game. That doesn't mean it can't change. But I think, as you mentioned to your point about players becoming more speed and skill-based, that's been a natural progression. We've seen the percentage of fights per hockey game go down steadily in the National Hockey League every year. The second point that you made as well, too, is that there used to be these guys who maybe played only 4 minutes a night, that's what they were there for, is kind of to grind it out, maybe to set the tone and get ready to fight somebody. And that's why they were on the bench. So you might have had 12 forwards dressed, but maybe only 10 or 11 of them played that night. Now you roll 4 lines because you can't afford the roster spot, but that doesn't mean that you don't have guys that can still pick them up and throw them down. Tom Wilson, as much as we all hate Tom Wilson, really good hockey player, very good hockey player when he's playing on the right side of that edge. He's a guy that, a lot of people don't want to mess with because he can throw the knuckles, and he can also, play a good 200-foot game. He's a good goal scorer as well. And third, I think people just say that it detracts from the flow of the game. I disagree so much. I want to hear your points first to see how many of them that you can set up. But as a former player and as someone who's played in leagues that fighting has happened, there are times where I got to be honest with you, players have a tendency to be able to police the game. We saw that with the New York Rangers situation. Obviously, you don't have line brawls every time you're policing the game, but I think there are moments where someone gets speared, they get slew-footed, they get hit from behind, the officials miss the call. Hey, you're going to have to answer the bell, and that's just going to be a part of it. And I think that no matter whether you're in an NHL game or you're at a pickup game on a Sunday night, there's a moment where if you cross the line that's big enough, you're going to have to answer the bell. And I think that still has to be a piece of the game of hockey.
So, to kind of state my position on it, I think it's important to first set when you talk about fighting, and I suppose why it's there, right? So back and I think that's important for me to lay out, because the reason we fight now versus even 40 years ago has also changed quite a bit. 40 years ago, fighting was, sort of, you could call it a territorial marking kind of thing. I don't know how else to describe it, but it was, this is my house, this is my ice. And, if you're going to win this game, you have to get through me physically, right?
Philadelphia Flyers, mid-1970s, classic example there.
Yes. So, a lot of other franchises, you can go back to the North Stars versus Boston Bruins and that very classic game. I mean, it was a show of strength is what it was back 40 years ago. That's how the game was just played at that time, right? So now let's fast forward it to nowadays. The reason why we fight now is, like you mentioned, you have Kirill Kaprizov, who gets hit from behind with a cross check, and he is your star rookie. He's a guy that he's a skilled player. You know that the team is better when he's on the ice. And if someone takes a run at him physically, you don't want, you essentially are, like you mentioned, you're policing the game as a player to say, if you're going to go after my star young player, now you have to come for me. It's like the best friend who's the bigger guy in middle school, who's, 5'10", and you're trying to protect on the, the playground, the guy that's 5'1", who just happened to get in a little scuffle. It's that brotherhood mentality is really what it is, right? So the question, I think, is arbitrary, and here's why. The fighting has a place in the game because you always are going to stick up for your teammates. But I think we also need to understand, too, that fighting itself has evolved, too. Let's even look at the rules the NHL has implemented. You can't even take off your own helmet when you are fighting now. The linesmen and the referees, they're not just sitting back and letting you just throw haymakers. When they see an opportunity to cancel a fight, they're going in and doing so. And so the league is starting to take a sort of more of a structural approach to try to reduce the fights, try to reduce the length, the possibility of injury. So I think the league has done as much as it can to try to, sort of control the emotions that lead to fighting in today's NHL. But at the end of it, again, if my guy is hit from behind, it's obviously like, from my perspective as a player, if you're on the ice and you feel like that was a run and intent to injure because the other team is down 5-1, it's the last game of the regular season, whoever wins the game has a chance to go into the playoffs, and now it's just frustration that's coming out. Do you really, as a player, and this is the part of, I think, the mentality that people miss is, as a player, if you do nothing, what's the most that happens? The referee blows it dead. The guy skates off unharmed. He maybe gets ejected, or even at worst case scenario, he gets a 2-minute, roughing call in the box. The players look at that and they don't see that as justice, right? They look at that and say, no, we know that's all that's going to happen. So for me to prevent that from happening again, I got to go retaliate for that action. And that lays into what we will talk about with Wilson and Buchnevich / Panarin. But for me, that's, to answer the question, a very long-winded answer. I apologize for listeners, but fighting will have a place in the game because of that. Now, we can have the argument whether you think that's a good idea, you think it's silly, but just know that when you got 20 guys in the locker room who all, fight together day in and day out, and in most times an 82 regular game season, you're blocking shots, you're laying the body on, everything is about sacrificing yourself for the betterment of the team, which means one of you guys goes down and it's the other team that's making that happen, you stick up for your teammate. That's the hockey team mentality. It's something that's sort of bred in you as you kind of grow in the game, Noah. And I don't think that's ever going to be taken out. Now, again, I think there will be continual reductions with rules and different things that will reduce the occurrences of fighting. Will they ever eliminate it? I don't think so. And I don't think the game will actually allow it. I don't think so.
And they shouldn't. And the reason being, when you talk about fighting has changed, the purpose of fighting is not, it's not to punch somebody's face in. I think in the 70s it was. I think there were times where you tried to kill somebody, and that was, you got a bunch of farm boys from Saskatchewan, and that was the way they made their living, was they were tough enough to chuck knuckles, and that's what their job was. I think the unwritten line has changed. What fighting does nowadays, and it did it back then too, but I think that it's evolved into maybe more its main purpose now. Fighting sets the precedent that there is this unwritten rule or this unwritten line that if you cross over that line, you will have to be accountable for your actions. And in some ways, it actually protects the players by being kind of like a preemptive, anticipatory, protective measure in a sense. So if you're playing the Washington Capitals, right? And let's say Tom Wilson, for a change, isn't the aggressor here. Let's say, they're playing the New York Rangers and Buchnevich comes up and hits somebody from behind. Tom Wilson goes and fights Buchnevich, right? They get into a scrap, whatever. Buchnevich has crossed the line. Now, when the Dallas Stars come to town and play the Washington Capitals the next night, and Sagan is going in the corner with Zdeno Chara, and he sees Chara's numbers. He knows that if I bury him from behind in the numbers, I got to answer to Tom Wilson. And it keeps him from doing those sorts of things, and it becomes a preemptive piece of that. So fighting players don't fight to fight anymore. You know, like they don't just do that to do that. And I don't think you meet a lot of players in general who want to drop the gloves. Like that is not their, like, I think it honestly makes a lot of players in some ways almost like upset, or like, it's just part of the job. It's like when I'm in nursing school and I see somebody with a giant wound on their back that smells really bad. I don't want to clean it, but it's part of the job. Fighting is a part of the job that you now have to do because you've seen this action happen that has crossed over that line. So
right.
You know, and I think that that's where people have to make that distinction, is that there's not guys out there that are goons anymore, if you will, that are there specifically to fight. They see something that happens, understand that they maybe can stand up for a player that maybe can't stand up for themselves, or maybe is hurt or down in the play. That's where I think it needs to be there, because like you mentioned, one, it's always been there, but two, it's just a piece of players being accountable, because at the end of the day, the officials, do they make the calls? The Department of Player Safety, are they supposed to suspend people? Yes. But in that moment, the temperature and momentum of the game changes based on the reaction of both teams as a result of that play. And you as a team don't want to back down and allow the other team to run over your star players or your best players.
And I agree with you 100%. I'm going to ask you just one counter argument before we get into our extra ice session here real quick.
Sure.
And I think the counter argument is, well, wait a second. Andrew Shaw, who retired from the NHL here at the very young age of 29, I believe, if I recall correctly. Yeah. He's retiring because of concussion issues, and a lot of that stems from fighting. So a big part of the discussion is, are we losing some players because of fighting? And number two, I mean, you know, for those who look at that side of fighting, who see the consequences, and, you know, that's true. There are consequences physically to having that many fights. I don't think we're anybody in this room between you, myself and you are going to deny that.
This huge room that we're in here. Right.
But at the same time, right, for those who look at his specific scenario, and it's not just him. Let's be honest. It's not just him who succumbed to, I could say, concussion problems, and, you know, has something to do with fighting. This is, you know, it's situations like that where I would say that, you know, the fans, whether you're casual, look at that and go, well, this is the negative side of fighting. And I think the question comes to be, Noah, is, you know, can we expect more situations like Andrew Shaw, where maybe his career is cut short because of fighting? Or, you know, are we, you know, as we discussed here the last couple of moments, fighting really isn't what it used to be. It's not something where I think everybody, like you said, looks forward to doing it, but you will answer the bell when called. But to me, Andrew Shaw played a game with an edge. To me, I don't think he looked forward to it, but he wasn't afraid to stick up in times where he needed to, not only for himself, but for his teammates. And I just don't, I want to get your opinion. So can the NHL ever prevent a situation like Andrew Shaw, where at the very young age of 29, someone I think who came to the league had a lot of promising upside in his offensive, he kind of found his jive with the role that he was in, kind of a grinder, kind of a hitter. Can the NHL ever prevent that? And I have a guess as to what your answer might be.
No. And Andrew Shaw's career didn't end because of fighting. And a lot of players' careers don't end because of fighting. I think the rare examples are maybe Colton Orr, right? Colton Orr falls against, I believe it was George Peros, if I'm not mistaken, right? But Colton Orr's career didn't end because of fighting. Colton Orr's career ended because he got hit in the face, fell on the ice, and then wasn't able to get back into the lineup because he was replaced in the lineup. He didn't end because of concussions. Concussions only account for a very, very small percentage. Fighting, I should say, accounts for a very small percentage of concussions. That's just not how physics works. You see more, you know, broken noses, broken hands, broken cheekbones, that sort of thing. Players generally don't get concussions from fighting. That's just not how it is. Now, to say it never happens, that would be wrong. People can get concussed from fighting, similar to how you and I go to a bar and get in a street fight and get concussed as well. I don't think the changes for fighting change the ways of how concussions work, simply because fans who don't play the game don't understand that your brain doesn't get jarred when you get punched. It's kind of a weird thing to think about. Your brain gets jarred when you're going at full speed, 25 miles an hour, and you hit a freight train coming to the corner, or you lose an edge and you hit the back of your head on the boards because you can't catch yourself. That's where the majority of concussions come from, is when you get hit, center of mass, and your extremities, rock harder as a result of that. So I don't think the changes in fighting, is it good for players to keep their helmets on? Yeah, absolutely. When they're fighting, that's smart, right? Do you need the stage fights where you have the big enforcer trying to pick somebody out who's 40 pounds lighter than him? Obviously not. Those are changes that you can implement. You're trying to get away from head contact, those sorts of things. But when it comes to fighting, concussions generally don't result out of a fight. And I don't think that any of those changes are going to change that. And it's so hard as a former player who's been around that to explain that perspective to people, because it's one of those things that you and I can sit here and talk about it all day. You don't realize how much fighting is a part of what you do and helps kind of keep the temperature down for things that are going on until you've lived it and you've been a part of it. And I know from the outside looking in, I understand your perspective perfectly. It doesn't make any freaking sense. It doesn't make sense that guys punch each other in the face when they have a disagreement in a sport. It doesn't make sense, but it's always been a part of our sport. And then when you jump on the ice, it does make sense. That's such a horrible way to explain it, but I don't know, as we push and just hit the 40-minute mark here, I don't know how else to explain that, Nick. Do you have a better way of explaining that? Because I don't think the changes in fighting are going to detract from concussions at all. The guys who get concussions are those gritty fourth line guys like you mentioned, but that's the way they play. They're physical, they're hard and heavy in the corners, and the jarring of their body during those fast-paced moments is what leads to their concussions. And maybe it's end capped by a concussion in a fight, but I don't think it's the culmination of fighting that leads to guys exiting the league.
The statistics would say you're correct. Andrew Shaw, he was a victim of some pretty nasty body collisions. And then when you fight on top of that, which again, as we discussed, was something he was never shy to answer the bell about. When you've already got, you could say maybe not a fully healed concussion, and then you add on fight, I think that's partly what, got to Andrew Shaw, honestly, in my opinion. Now, you're correct. I think if you were going to pin it solely on fighting, that's really not the case. But to wrap up the segment here quickly, I think that, again, fighting, it's more of the threat of the fight than the fighting itself was what polices the players versus players on the ice, right?
Yep.
And that's really what it is, because, again, the refs can call a penalty, they can eject somebody, but it doesn't take away your player getting hurt. It doesn't take away that, they felt that they had the right to skate in and cross-check somebody in the numbers into the boards, which is a dangerous play, could have resulted in not only a very serious injury, but, potentially a career-ending injury, or at least a long-term one, right?
And let's mention that too very, very quickly. How many NHL fights have you seen from clean hits? Think about that. You know what I mean? Some of them happen. Some of them where guys think that the hit isn't clean, and maybe you look back and it is clean. Majority of fights start from a disagreement between two players and they're just settling it themselves, or two, something happened that was not policed or not regulated within the rules of the game that they've crossed over that line. And the one thing I wanted to ask you, Nick, too, because I don't know if you ever actually said, do you feel that fighting in today's NHL still has a place?
So it has a place because not for the simple fact that it's allowed. I think it's important to make that distinction.
Yep.
Because it's the player's way to police themselves when the call is missed, or when the call isn't to the level that the players think it might rise to. And with that, I think that transitions perfect, Noah, as we, again, just passed the 40-minute mark. That will end our regular session here for the Huskies Warmer Nose podcast. We're going to transition into the extra ice session. We're going to talk about the NHL's Department of Player Safety here, and sort of, one, their current role, and number two, with the most recent events surrounding Tom Wilson, does there have to be changes made? And I think that's a conversation that has to be had. Welcome into our extra ice segment here on the Huskies Warmer Nose podcast. Nick Maxon alongside my co-host Noah Grant. Today's topic is, I think, a very interesting one here, Noah, and it stems back from an incident earlier this week that involved Tom Wilson, Pavel Buchnevich, and then sort of carried on into Artemi Panarin per se. So for those who missed it, there was essentially New York had an offensive chance. Vucinovic, you could maybe say had, maybe a late little stick jab into the Rangers goaltender. The Washington goaltender.
There you are.
He wouldn't be doing his old goaltender. Can't tell it's Saturday. And then Tom Wilson, he went in and was protecting his goaltender. That to me was okay. They both went to the ice, but then as Vucinovic is prone, he's face to the ice. Tom Wilson decides, I don't like the way that you went into my goaltender, and decided to punch him while he's down, face down, I should say, on the ice, and essentially took a cheap shot at him, right? So it wasn't a light push. It wasn't, a little jab. It was a full-on punch, right? So then what happens is Artemi Panarin sees this. He comes over. He actually climbs on the back of Tom Wilson. Tom Wilson, because I hate to say it, but he's a strong man. He's a big dude. Artemi Panarin is not quite as big or as strong as Tom Wilson is. Artemi Panarin, for no disrespect, he got ragdolled pretty good. And Artemi Panarin, unfortunately, due to the scrum, suffered what we now know as a season-ending injury. Vucinovic and then essentially tried to retaliate during that sense. Well, what happened out of this was Tom Wilson was given a penalty on the ice. It was not a major penalty. And then on top of that, the Department of Player Safety only fined him $5,000. Now, a couple of caveats to this, Noah. Tom Wilson is, from the fans' perspective, a repeat offender, meaning he's done stuff like this before. Under the terms of the collective bargaining agreement and to the Department of Player Safety, he technically is not a repeat offender. And so there was this huge uproar about the lack of discipline, which then leads to 2 nights later, essentially a opening line brawl to start game 2 between these two clubs in the season. And essentially, everybody's wondering who's watching the game, whether you're a close fan or a casual fan, what happened here? And more importantly, what happened? Was there a miss by the Department of Player Safety? And if that's true, what needs to change? And Noah, I want to start with you. First of all, should have Tom Wilson been suspended? Number one, or I should say number two, if he was to be suspended, how long would you suspend him? And we'll start with that, and then we'll kind of go through this step by step here.
Sure. Well, I think it actually stems a little bit from the piece of our fighting conversation. One of the other unwritten rules of hockey is that when a player is down on the ice, when they're down in that moment where you can tell that they've gone into a defensive mode, they're no longer up, they're no longer trying to fight back, that sort of thing, you let them go. So that's the first piece of this, is that when Vucinovic is down and Wilson's wrapped around him and he starts kind of punching him, that's just a definite no-no. I mean, that's one of those things where, again, to talk about how fighting works, regardless of the outcome of that play or the fine, if you're Tom Wilson, you're going to get your ass kicked. Like you don't punch my teammate in the back of your head. Sorry, not sorry. The second thing is Panarin comes in. You got to understand that Panarin's job in this role is when he pushes Wilson to the boards. A lot of times what you see happen in fights is that even if guys aren't fighting, they grab onto each other. One guy takes another guy, and the goal is to kind of keep them away from the scrum or try to kind of keep each other in check so that if something is going on, you don't let a guy just kind of run in out of nowhere because you didn't have a handle on your guy. So it's funny, even during fights, it's still man-on-man coverage, if you will. But then Panarin comes in, he pins Wilson, up against the wall. Wilson, I don't think had the real right to pick him up and ragdoll him and smash his head to the ice. But 2, if you're Artemi Panarin, you grabbed on to the guy who was kind of being a miscreant. You involved yourself in that play. Panarin didn't deserve to get his head smashed in the ice. We just said that, but you kind of engaged with the bear, if you know what I mean. So, and again, good on Panarin for stepping in that opportunity. So I think the result sucks, but I think I'm almost more distressed by the Vucinovic piece of it than the Panarin piece, even though the Panarin piece looked worse. So for me, should Tom Wilson have been suspended? I think the easy answer is yes, but I don't think it should have been this giant lengthy suspension that people are calling for. I think they look at Tom Wilson and say, oh, well, he's had all these fines. He's had all these things happen to him. Oh, suspend this guy 10 games. He's garbage, that sort of thing, whatever, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. People say the same things about Brad Marchand, but people don't call for Brad Marchand's head in the same way that they call for Tom Wilson's head just because Tom plays with more of an edge. I would have maybe given him a game at maximum 2. I don't think anything more than that because, yeah, he punched a guy in the back of the head. He Todd Bertuzzi'd him a little bit. He sucker punched him in the back of the head. but he gave him 2 shots and then he was kind of pulled off of Buchnevich there. So I don't know, 2 games maximum, I would say, would be fair. I'm curious to know your assessment on that, because I thought it could have been a suspension play, but I didn't look at it, the same way I looked at the Steve Downey incident, the Donald Bashir incident, where it made me sit back on my seat and say, holy shit, But I mean, it was something where I was like, you know what, he crossed the line. And at the end of the day, it was funny. We heard a bunch of fans say, this is why fighting is garbage in the game of hockey. Nobody stood up to Tom Wilson in that moment. Yeah, because in that moment, I guess they probably expected out of the result of that scrum for the Department of Player Safety to do their job. They didn't do their job, and that's where the retaliation happened. So, fighting is also about a time and a place. It's not always just, we're going to chuck it with Tom Wilson the next time he steps on the ice. You got to understand, it was a 4-4 hockey game at that point. So again, it's a time and a place. So there's a lot of caveats that go into this, but above all, yeah, I thought he deserved a little bit more than he got, but not outrageous 5 or 10 game suspensions.
So let's address this one by one, right? So number one, I agree with you. I think one of the things that often gets missed in this specific situation is the key piece for me is the Buchnevich part. Again, it was a guy that was face down on the ice. Wilson is almost, kind of in that wrestling where he's actually on top of him, bear hugging, and his head is facing him. And he punctures him in the back of the neck. That's a no-no, right? Now, Buchnevich doesn't get injured because of the punch. He does get up and actually tries to re-engage in Tom Wilson there. So I don't like the cheap shot. To me, that was the egregious play. And as you mentioned, if I'm Artemi Panarin, yeah, you're being a teammate and you're stepping up for somebody else. The problem is, as I mentioned before, you decided to dance with the much bigger human being and also a much stronger human being. I don't like the fact that Artemi Panarin got injured, but he was almost like a third man in that sense, because not only was Panarin involved, there's some other Rangers players that came over to engage in Tom Wilson too. At that point, Wilson's just trying to defend himself, right? At one point, actually, Artemi Panarin is actually off the ice because he's actually on Tom Wilson's back for a little bit. So to me, yeah, I never want to see a player get injured, but when you step into the dance floor, you have to know what you're, stepping into and what could happen. So to me, I think he should have gotten at least 1 or 2 games. I don't think a fine is there. But I think the conversation, Noah, and this is where the conversation really is surrounding Tom Wilson. That is, he has a history of these sort of things, right? And for the Department of Player Safety, mind you, safety is in their name, right? So I think and it's funny we laugh because I think everybody's a different idea what their role really is, right? Is their role reactionary or is their role preventative? I think some people have this idea that it should be a bit of both, right? I think when the Department of Player Safety was created, it was certainly more reactionary, right? It is, you do something, you're going to get either suspension or a fine. And I think what has sort of culminated from themselves being around is we've seen some lengthy suspensions. It's been rare that we've seen it. Hashtag Rafi Torres. But at the end of it, those are very, very rare, right? And they're very egregious situations. And yeah, there's this, I think there's a dichotomy that says, yeah, you did bad, but we also know that, you're a professional athlete. We can't hold you out for so long. Again, when a player is suspended, they forfeit that game's worth of salary to the department, to essentially the NHL Players Association Fund. So they do lose money from that. So I guess the next attack here, Noah, is, does the Department of Player Safety need to change their MO? Which means right now you do something bad, you're being punished for essentially the crime given. But I think what people are uproaring about is, yeah, you suspend Wilson or give him $5,000 fine, but that's not preventing him from doing it again. Does the Department of Player Safety need to have more of a preventative, kind of caveat to what they do? Or, in these situations, do you think that maybe, I guess, how would you change the way that they suspend or whatnot based on what we see now?
Well, I think that they should have a role in both sides of that. And it almost goes back to the reason why players fight, right? Is to prevent the next occurrence like that from happening and set the standard, if you will. I think the Department of Player Safety has a similar, opportunity to do that. Like you mentioned, they were kind of a group that was maybe a little bit more reactionary and maybe a little bit more after the fact, if you will. But again, you hope that the decisions for that set the precedent for future opportunities, similar to, if Marty Brodeur, for whatever reason, takes the puck and T-drags around 5 defensemen and turns every play into a 6-on-5, and then they say now goaltenders can't go across the red line. Well, you've now prevented that change in the game based on that ruling, and you move forward accordingly. I think that's where the Department of Player Safety has an opportunity to do that. The goal of that specific department, and this might be obvious to us, but for some people it might not be so obvious. Their goal is actually to take the rule book as it is defined, look at the play that happens, look at it in context, and define whether or not the parameters of the rule book were followed or not followed and where the breakdown is, and explain that to people and say, this is how we arrived at this decision because the wording says this. This is how this situation relates to the wording. This is why it is or isn't, a fine or a suspension or what have you. I think that maybe having the Department of Player Safety in a little bit more of that piece of when rule changes occur, not only being preventative as far as their decision making, but also saying, hey, we've seen a rise in X types of plays, or we've seen this statistic, or we've seen these types of plays really occurring. What can we change within the rule book to change that? Secondly, after the rule book has been implemented for that season, what actions have you seen that you want to set a precedent for? I think the biggest problem people have with the Department of Player Safety is that suspensions or plays that look similar do not carry the same weight based on who it is, based on the type of play. And I think that frustrates a lot of people where you can say, oh, well, this person slashed this person in the leg, he got 5 games, but this person slashed this person in the ankle, they got 2 games. What's the deal with that? I think that's where the breakdown is occurring. We've set the precedent throughout NHL history that you can't Donald Brashear somebody in the side of the head, right? You can't come flying in like Steve Downey and leave your feet and send somebody into the boards. You can't do those things. Those are going to be lengthy suspensions. We've also set the precedent that if you are a repeat offender in terms of suspensions under the collective bargaining agreement, the more and more you do those things, a la Matt Cook, the more and more you're going to be fined more heavily for plays that other players might not be fined. They've set those 2 precedents, but where they have the breakdown, I think, is those guys that maybe are starting to become repeat offenders, or maybe do something similar to a guy who's the same status as them, and the suspension or the punishment doesn't match up from crime to crime, if you will. So that's where I think the change needs to be made. My question to you is, how do you make that change where you can have more parity in terms of the suspensions? Because every case and every play in hockey is different.
And that's the challenge, right? I think the challenge that the Department of Player Safety has is, number one, they are confined to the way the rule book and the CBA has essentially allowed them to, right? So speaking of which, this is the actual definition of a repeat offender status by the NHL. They are considered a repeat offender for 18 months following his most recent incident that resulted in a suspension. His status as a repeat offender in this category, and I want to highlight that in this category, and I'll get back to why that's important here in just a moment, is used to determine the amount of salary forfeited should he receive another suspension. Here is the next sentence, Noah, and I think this is important for all fans to know. I quote, "It is important to note that even if a player is not defined as a repeat offender by the CBA, his past history may come into consideration when determining future supplemental discipline." So it's interesting because the NHL is saying right there, hey, if you do the same thing over and over again, we may suspend you longer. Let's actually take that framework and let's put that into Tom Wilson, right? Tom Wilson, his suspensions have been for checks, and more importantly, illegal checks to the head. This is not a check to the head. And so when you talk about different plays in hockey being unique, this is the challenge the Department of Player Safety has, and that is everything happens quick. Not everything circumstances or context the same way. Yes, maybe Tom Wilson boards a player. Not everything sets up the same way. Not everything happens the same way. But could you say a check to the head where you're targeting could be? Yes. I think where you have to start is the CBA, honestly. I think a repeat offender status, to me, they're using it in the context of the category, which means Tom Wilson is being suspended because he did a cheap shot, a punch after a whistle. They're not taking into consideration his past targets to the head or any other past discipline. I think there's some good in that because you don't want to wrap in an after the whistle punch, especially when it results in a non-injury, to something that did cause an injury and that essentially was more preventative or could have taken a different angle, that kind of thing. So I think that is the wording that has to change. On the flip side of it, to the question I posed to you earlier, does the Department of Player Safety, first of all, I think the number one question here before I leave, the answer is the NHL safer now than it was before with the Department of Player Safety? I don't think so, honestly. I think it's the changes to the rule book that have changed that. And so I think that's the other caveat to the DOPS, and that is, how do we more establish ourselves as not just we're going to give you the proper consequences after you violate a rule, but also how can we set a better precedent where maybe this is more of a deterrent, AKA put the foot on the ground and say, we're not going to allow this from you specifically anymore. And if we do, we're looking at different stuff.
And they did that. The most prime and recent example is head contact, head targeting. That's the one where they changed, where you said, even if you clipped a guy, even if he didn't see you, even if it wasn't intentional, if it results in an injury, boom, you're gone.
Yep. But that's more of a rule book change. That's not a Department of Player Safety change. And I think that's where people are kind of on the edge. It's like, well, so what does this group actually do, right? And I think that is a fair question right now. I want to make a sub point here, Noah, real quick, and that is, for those who think the firing of the Rangers president GM is not related to that, you're full of crap. 100% related. Absolutely.
You think? I actually disagree with
100%. And here's why.
Not a chance.
So I have been, well, first of all,
Okay.
I've covered the league for 13 years. This is how this works. So when you are an NHL team, you are essentially an independent contractor working underneath the NHL badge, which means, and there's specifics to each franchise, you do not bad talk the league at all. Not 100%. Here's what happened. The Rangers, and here's the thing, I would love to know who actually sent out the tweet. I want to know if the president and GM were aware of it. Was it somebody that was involved in social media? I would like to know who framed it, who wrote it, and who approved it going out. Here's one thing. Anytime you badmouth a league, you are getting a major fine. Whose fine does that come out of? The owner's pocketbook. When the Rangers were essentially 10-3 in the month of March, and then also I forget the exact stat, but they were 19-10 the last 2 months. And you're going to sit there and tell me there was a culture change needed for the New York Rangers after they were a team that, to me, had won some really good luck with the draft lottery, who were a team that was trending up, a team that, to me, I thought was playing good hockey in a very, very tough division. They had a winning record. They're at +9 in the last 2 months of the season. You're not firing your president and GM 2 years into what the general standard is for GM is at least the 3-year mark. The 3-year mark is when you kind of get a sense of where the team is going at that point. I think 2 years is still too early. Now, the Minnesota Wild fired Paul Fenton because of internal issues, right? So unless there's something really that audacious that's happening, you're not doing a general manager change because of culture. BS. And guess what happened? After they fired him, guess what happened? $250,000 fine. So 100% from my book, and I'll be on the record say this, that is related to Rangers ownership. Because I don't think the Rangers ownership were aware of the message that was being sent. And again, the NHL is going to bite your hand, fist, and mouth if you bad talk anybody in the league. 100% related in my book.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the statement here, and that's where it just says statement from the New York Rangers. I don't know though. I guess I don't disagree with you. I just kind of look at that and look at the comments. And again, he might just be saving face, but I look at comments from their owner, and he said that he wasn't happy from 20 games into the season. And I think that says something where you look at that and maybe say, maybe the plan was that Chris Drury next year was going to be the guy anyway. And they said, hey, we're not happy about this incident. We're going to pull the trigger. We're going to release these two guys. And it's going to look more unceremonious, if you will, based on the events that transpired. And they're just pushing Chris Drury into that role at that particular point. I don't know.
Here's the issue. The timing doesn't make sense. You have 4 games left. 4, 5, or 6 at that point. To me, why would you make the change then? It's 6 games. You're not going to do anything different. You're not going to experience any culture change in 6 games left in the.
But that's my point. My point is saying maybe they were ready to release him at the end of the season, and
So why not wait?
And then they're using the incident to just kind of say, oh, I can justify this change a lot more during a rebuild by surrounding it from the incident, but not saying it's from the incident. So I'm like qualifying your statement. It was because of the incident, but not because of the incident. Does that make sense?
I get what you're saying, but the problem is
the timing works just because they were going to maybe do it at the end of the season anyway. And this incident is the perfect cover up / not cover up for what was already about to happen based on
I disagree.
Play this year.
So the Rangers had a slow start, 100%. But this team was trending up. And again, you're in a very, very, very tough division in hockey, arguably one of the best top-down divisions in the NHL. I just don't understand how after less than 2 years, honestly, less than 2 for John Davidson, while you're taking a team that's trending up, you had a team that was 19-10 in their last 29 games.
Didn't the Chicago Blackhawks do the same thing a couple of years ago, though?
This isn't the Chicago Blackhawks. I'm just going to throw that right back at you. You're also not talking about a situation where there was, in my opinion, a social media lapse with a situation involving your star player that you're paying $11.5 million a year, and you're upset about it. Again, that's just how these things work. Every team knows that the Department of Player Safety, the referee, they're not going to get things right. And if you notice coaches' comments when they talk about refereeing, they pretty much they say very small things that they didn't like it, but they're not going to outright say. And this is the part that goofed the Rangers. They called out George Peros by name, and they also said he was unfit to be in his present position. They went that far with it. I think if they would have released something again, the issue that I want to know is who typed it up and who released it, and did the ownership and did the GM and the press actually know about this statement? I have a hard time believing that they didn't know about it, but I would have an inkling that the ownership for sure didn't know about it. I can tell you that. But to my point is, if they would have said, we're very disappointed in the player's decision, we feel like it should have been different, leave it at that. Or Moso, how about this? The ownership said every 32 now NHL franchises have Gary Bettman's cell phone number. You could have each say, let's get on a conference call. George, Gary Bettman, and the owners of the Rangers go, what in the hell is this? I think there would have been an opportunity there for a conversation. That obviously didn't happen. It was obviously whoever released the statement was an emotional time. You're losing your best star forward. And again, I don't think they've disclosed his injury per se, at least to what it was, or if it's long-term or short-term. Again, the Rangers are out of the playoffs. They're done after 6 games. But to me, what's so impressive about this, and why this to me is all related, is, again, you're +9 in the win column. This team is trending up. You're in the toughest division in the hockey. You release a statement, then boom, they get fired. Boom, $250,000 fine, which again comes right out of the owner's pocketbooks. I don't care if you're worth $1.25 billion. If you're an owner, $250,000 still hurts, especially if you did nothing or someone below you that you're supposed to trust and run a franchise and know that you cannot badmouth the league. It doesn't matter how much you're worth. $250,000 is hard for anybody to swallow. So to me, that's why it's related.
Yeah, okay, but then my question is this: at the GM meetings next year, what do they tell the DOPS and say, okay, guys, this needs to change. We've had a problem with this / being 3 games, this / being 5 games. How do they set that precedent where they look at and say, you know what, when players do X, Y, and Z, they're going to get this. When players do this, the minimum is this.
Here's the problem. It's not a conversation that can be had because, again, the Department of Player Safety is run and its framework is the CBA. That's what needs to change first. So again, you talk about the repeat offender status. This is all language that is under the CBA. So again, right now it's 18 months and they talk about specific categories. I think starting after the end of next year is when I believe negotiations for a new CBA are going to start. No question, if this sort of thing continues to happen, this is going to be, I think, a very interesting topic for both the owners and the Players Association and the league itself to have to really come down to. And that is, again, and I think the first question is, as we were discussing before, Noah, is what is the role of the Department of Player Safety? Has it evolved? Does it need to be more preventative with their discipline? Or do they just want to say, hey, you get a speeding ticket, pay a fine. We only want to focus in on the ramifications of stuff that's already done and not worry about what could happen in the future.
But what about, but my question is this: should the Department of Player Safety also say, hey, you got a speeding ticket that was between X mile per hour and X mile per hour? That means that the fine falls under this category based on X, Y, and Z. And and that's where it's just like, I think there's a problem where it's like, if Matt Cook hacks somebody in the ankle, it's 6 games, but then if Kirill Kaprizov does it, he gets a $500,000 fine or something like that. I don't know.
Here's the issue, though.
Or 5,000 maximum allowable under the CBA.
Right. Here's the problem, though. As you and I both know, if Matt Cook hacks a guy that is facing the boards, is not even engaged in the play, and he injures and breaks his ankle, right? That's one thing. If Kirill Kaprizov hacks somebody, they're facing each other and they both were hacking at each other, you decide to fine 5,000. I don't think you can clearly identify each situation that comes to the department I don't think you can put that into one conglomerate. I don't think that's possible. To your point, though, I do think there is an opportunity for the Department of Player Safety to go, I think what they need to really rewrite is the repeat offender status and get rid of the categorical things. Because, and here's why I say that. The Department of Player Safety right now, to me, is handcuffed with the fact that Tom Wilson punched a guy. And honestly, he's really never done that in a way that caused the DOPS to be alerted, per se. A lot of what his suspensions of fines have been is for illegal checks to the head. So they're going off of, okay, he hasn't done this specific thing before. So they're looking at it incident by incident. What I think needs to happen is, if Tom Wilson is a guy that continually breaks rules, plural, I don't think it should matter if it's a check to the head or a roughing a punch after the whistle. If he's displaying behavior where he's continually breaking rules that is supposed to help keep players safe, that to me is where the wording needs to be reworked. Because then it's like, okay, hey man, instead of the conversation ending like this, right? So here's how the conversation on Wilson happens. Okay, hey man, you punched somebody, you haven't really done that before, just gonna fine you. Now it's like, hey Tom, you punched somebody. Hey, just a couple months ago, you're chicken winging somebody and you did, it was an intent to injury, put their elbow up. What's going on with you, man? Because of your essentially disrespect to the rules, plural, of the game, we're going to suspend you 7 games because obviously you are creating an environment that could lead other players to get injured, and not just look at it as to what specifically he did. I think that's where things really need to change for the National Hockey League. If the fans / the players are going to feel confident that they're doing their job, which is, yes, reprimandation, but also preventative type stuff. And I think that's how you have to do it.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is. I don't know where you say, what is a repeat offender? What is the time period for a repeat offender? I mean, like, if you have a guy, and not that it should make a difference in terms of like injuries, but I mean, like, for lack of a better term, when you play hockey, shit happens. I mean, that just, it does. So it's like, do you say once an offender, always an offender? Do you do a time frame? Because it's like, if you do something when you're 22 and then you accidentally elbow someone in the face when you're 36, does that mean that you're now a repeat offender after 15 years? You know what I mean? Like,
right. And that's partly why it's at 18 months right now. So that's the other side of the coin, right? How much weight do we want to put on past happenings, right? And I think that's where I don't think there ever is going to be a very good answer for a lot of people. I think it's always going to be subjective no matter what way you look at it. And again, with Tom Wilson specifically, he has a knack where it seems like at least once a season, he has gotten himself in a position where he does something that is above the rules, that's causing an injury, and that's blatantly something he does not have to do. And I hate to do this, but Tom Wilson, if he plays the right way, he's actually a hell of a hockey player.
Great hockey player. Yeah.
He actually, for a guy that is as physical as he is, he actually has got some pretty darn good skating ability. He's got good skill. He reads plays well. So it's almost like a weird case study with Tom Wilson too, just on the mentality side. And that is, if you can just get him to knock off some of this, over the top stuff, he's actually a pretty darn good hockey player.
Same with Brad Marchand when he was licking people, and then he stopped licking people, and then played well in the playoffs, right? Like,
right. And so, and again, I don't know what the exact fix is. I don't know if anybody knows that answer, but I do think it is gotten to the point now where as we enter the next phase of negotiations for the new CBA, I don't think the league is going to be able to essentially push this one under the rug. I think it's going to have to be addressed. again, what they need to change, what they should change. I've laid out some of my thoughts. I don't know what they could adopt because, again, the league, the Players Association, and essentially the board governors, the owners, all have to agree to put that language, whatever they come up with, in the CBA. That means 3 different parties have to say, yep, this looks good. And let's just say the NHL has a history of not really liking to come together to terms on the CBA in years past. Isn't that right, Noah?
Yeah. I thought it was funny. I was on Twitter the other day, and I saw a Minnesota Wild fan say that the Tom Wilson incident that just happened was worse than Kevin Fiala's hit from behind on was it Matt Roy? Yeah. I had the same reaction. I was like, that hit by Fiala, even though it was unintentional, was pretty bad.
Was bad. So, yeah. and I think that's the other line that I think on a separate note, the other line the NHL has to drop is should there be a line with, okay, yeah, Kevin Fiala's a thing. Yeah, it was a check from behind, but how can you subjectively or maybe more objectively say this was not an intentional play? Just maybe, luck of the draw or bad timing or whatever you want to call it, bad circumstances versus.
And I think that if you're the Department of Player Safety, you have to have, as much people love him or hate him, people like George Peros, you have to have former NHLers in there who know what it's like to go in that situation and can recognize, like when I watch a hockey game, right? When I watch a player make a turn or try to step through a cross check or that sort of thing, I almost can I don't know, and I know you can do it too. It's almost like a sixth sense where you and I feel that play. We see it and we feel ourselves in that environment. One, because we've probably been a part of something like it, but 2, we just know what the emotions feel like. You have to have former players in there. I know people want to turn it into more of a business like big wig type thing. You have to have former players in those roles because they understand best what it feels like to be on both sides of that argument.
Also, more so and we talk about the speed of the game, but a lot of things happen quick, right? I think the biggest example I can give to Wild fans is let's talk about Matt Martin versus Keith Ballard, right? Matt Martin goes essentially all the way east-west of the ice. Keith Ballard is trying to dump a puck from center, and Keith Ballard actually turns his back towards Matt Martin and puts his face directly towards the boards. He ends up injured, and guess what? There's no penalty call. And I remember the outcry of Wild fans, well, that was a dirty play. It's like, well, no. Keith Ballard, if he stays parallel shoulder to shoulder,
put himself in that position.
He put himself in a vulnerable position too. So, I think another thing that the Department of Player Safety could work on is how you define an unintentional circumstance versus an intent to injure type situation. I think that's also something they could add into what they could do. So that way, if they feel like it's an intent to injure kind of a play, and again, it's all subjective, right? There's not going to be something you can write down that it's going to fall into everything. But I think you do have to somehow take that into consideration too. I think it does now, but I don't think it takes enough of that into play, right? And so, Keith Ballard, going back to that, he put himself in a very bad spot. Yeah, he gets injured, but it was his own damn fault, unfortunately. And Keith Ballard is a really good hockey player, but if he just stays shoulder to shoulder, yeah, it takes a big hit, but he's not putting himself into what could have gotten him paralyzed. It's a big no-no in hockey. Learn that in Pee-wees, Noah. You never face the boards or turn face towards the boards, especially when you're not on it. When you have that gap of 3-4 feet, you land in that head snaps back. That could be a life-changing event there for the player.
Well, the timing is important too, right? It's again, if he turns 5 seconds before Matt Martin gets there and Matt Martin continues to follow through with that play, then it's like, have you hit a defenseless player at that point versus have you made yourself a defenseless player? So the timing is everything as far as like we see players turn all the time. Have you turned and not given the attacking forward or player the ability to pull up in that situation and not finish the play that they've already initiated? Hockey happens fast. I mean, it's split second, bang, bang. And then when you're on top of that, if you're on for a shift for 30 seconds in period number 3 and you're kind of sucking wind a little bit, you're not thinking, I don't want to say you're not thinking clearly, but you're playing a sport at high speed when you're tired. There's a lot of factors that go into it then versus just the big black and white. A casual hockey fan who's never played the game in their life and who's watching the super slow-mo replay on NBC Sports going, well, look at that. Look at how he got hit and that sort of thing. There's a lot of plays that happens in scrums and things like that are a little bit almost borderline, but they get sorted out because the officials separate them. The guys separate or nothing happens. sometimes it's just luck of the draw. Things that become catalysts are sometimes not the events that you would expect them to be. They can be little things like Brad Marchand licking a guy in the face. Honestly, if some dude licked me in the face while I was on the ice, I'd think it'd be kind of weird, but I probably wouldn't start a line brawl. But I know other people that they would absolutely lose their shit over something like that. So, I mean, again, it's all relative, and I don't really know what the particular answer is. But Nick, I don't know, do we have anything else to add on this, or are we getting on out of here? What do you think? You have anything else?
I have one more thing to add.
Okay.
That is, for those who, for Tom Wilson's sake, right? First of all, I think he's a good hockey player when he uses his skill set and his physicality in the right way. There's no question he makes an impact on the game. He's strong. He's actually got a good shot. He's got good offensive instincts. And I'm not trying to defend him by any means. What he did was horrible. But it's how do you, as a department player student, the question is, how do you get more out of the player we think Tom Wilson and should you see more of like that? And how do we try to take away some of the maybe not so good parts of his game? Because I think, honestly, if you take away, obviously, his bad doings, he's had a lot of them. He's a great hockey player. He really is. But how do we set the consequences and maybe future penalties that would deter him from making more of those same mistakes? And I think that's really what it comes down to, Noah. But at the end of it, that should, unless you have anything more to add, I want to make sure I cut you off.
Yeah, well, I was just going to add that we have an exciting lineup coming up this Tuesday. Speaking of Kevin Fitzgerald and that trivia question, Kevin Fitzgerald and now former St. Cloud State Husky senior Tyler Anderson are going to be joining us on Tuesday for the Healthy Scratch interview segment to tell us about their respective paths, why Kevin came back, and what the heck Tyler is up to in his next stage of his career. So that's all I had to add. And of course, it's coming up on Tuesday.
Coming up on Tuesday. So with that being said, Dan, thank you for sticking around here for the extra ice session here in the Huskies Roman House podcast. Again, stick around for us this upcoming Tuesday when now super senior, and I know I'm going to get crap for that, Kevin Fitzgerald joins us, as well as now departing senior Tyler Anderson will be joining us on the show. Obviously, a lot of great discussion points we'll get to on those guys. For Noah Grant, I'm Nick Maxim. We'll see you guys back here in the den here in a couple of days.
One-timer, come in, they score! Ripped in! A bomb from Pervix!
So Dana Rasmussen fires and she scores! Dana Rasmussen for the Huskies alongside
Dwayne Kaprizov in for a chance to win it! He scores! Kirill the Thrill is for real! Welcome to the NHL!
Cathedral is now 42.6 seconds away from wrapping up the school's first ever title.